The topic of discussion today is how to write and format a conclusion. Now, we must begin by asking ourselves an important question, that what is a conclusion? A conclusion, as we understand, is the formal end of an academic answer or a research article. It is the final paragraph that we write to close the arguments that have been presented earlier. The conclusion structurally is a critical component of all formats of academic writing. While the introduction as such announces the intentions of the writer, and thereafter the sections in the body develop arguments, the conclusion must perform a critical function. It is a very demanding task, and that is to synthesize knowledge. It is to affirm and establish the significance of the discussion, and also to bring a sense of interpretive closure to the reader. Now, despite the importance and the centrality of the conclusion, it is very frequently treated as peripheral and formulaic, particularly by young and novice writers who are new to academic writing. Very often, the conclusion is perceived as merely a repetitive summary, a repetition of ideas, than, a dynamic site of intellectual engagement. So we must therefore closely examine the role of the conclusion. What is the function, the chief function of a conclusion? Firstly, it synthesizes arguments. Synthesis is an important function of the conclusion. Why? Because you see, the conclusion represents a culmination of ideas. It represents the culmination of the writer's analytical reasoning. So all the critical arguments that have been presented in the academic answer or the research article culminates in the conclusion. Another important function of the conclusion is to affirm significance. That is to say, a strong conclusion does not merely end the paper. It completes it. And how does it complete the paper? It completes the paper by demonstrating how the research question has been answered and why the argument matters. So therefore, the conclusion must resonate with other ideas in a broader academic framework. That is the reason why the conclusion must reaffirm the significance of the discussion. And finally, the conclusion must provide a sense of closure. That is, it must sum up the preceding discussions. So these are chiefly the three functions of the conclusion in academic writing. Now, the conclusion also performs certain rhetorical functions. Because remember, at its core, the conclusion is a rhetorical device. It is designed not simply to restate information, but it has to be persuasive. It has to persuade the readers that the argument that has been presented is coherent, that it is valid, and that it is significant. If we look at classical rhetoric, then the conclusion, which was also called the peroratio, was the stage at which speakers summarized their case and then appealed to the audience's judgment. Now, we have moved far away from classical rhetoric, but you see, the conclusion still retains this rhetorical imperative. That is to say that the conclusion must convince the readers. It must convince the readers that the discussion has achieved its purpose, that the discussion has achieved its end. So therefore, we must examine the rhetorical functions of the conclusion. There are three important rhetorical functions performed by the conclusion. And what are they? Let us list them. The first is closure, the second is emphasis, and the third is positioning. So closure, emphasis, and positioning. Now let us examine and try to analyze these terms more deeply. What do we mean by closure? One of the primary rhetorical functions of a conclusion is to provide closure. When we watch a film, for instance, or when we read a book, as a reader or as a viewer, our expectation is to find a sense of closure at the end of the narrative. So, similarly, in academic writing, academic arguments, we must understand, are cumulative. They build layer upon layer of evidence and interpretation. So you see, while framing our arguments, we are supporting them with evidence. So claim is always backed by evidence, by supporting evidence. It is always substantiated. And therefore, the academic answer or the research article that is being written is cumulative in its impact. So we layer one argument upon the other. It is a development. A clear pattern of development is visible. But you see, without a clear conclusion, without a definite conclusion, the text often runs the risk of feeling unfinished. Very often the text appears to be fragmented or incomplete if there is no proper conclusion that has been written. So the conclusion signals that the analytical process has reached its endpoint, that a logical endpoint has been reached. And this allows the readers the opportunity to step back and to assess the argument as a whole. Once I read the conclusion of an academic answer or a research article, as a reader, I can analyze and assess the argument as a whole. I don't see it as fragmented or in pieces, but I see, in effect, the whole picture. So that is the first rhetorical function that is served by the conclusion. Closure. It's a very, very important issue. The second point, or the second rhetorical function of the conclusion, is emphasis. Now, what do we mean by emphasis? As the term suggests, the writer cannot simply assume that the reader will automatically recognize what is the most important aspect of the argument. We cannot simply make an assumption that after reading the academic answer or the essay or the article, the reader will automatically know or will be able to identify what is the most important aspect of the argument. There is always a thrust in any academic answer or research article. There is a thrust, a key issue or a key area that is being addressed, a key argument that is being highlighted. So the reader cannot automatically grasp what is the key issue or the most important aspect of an argument. And that is where the conclusion is useful. Because what the conclusion does is that it emphasizes, it highlights the key insights, the key critical insights that the writer wishes to deliver. And what it ensures is that the central contribution of the work remains salient, it remains relevant, and it is properly understood. So in this sense, the conclusion guides interpretation. It shapes how the readers remember and evaluate the text. So emphasis is very important. And finally, the third rhetorical function is positioning. Now, the conclusion serves a positioning function. And what do we mean by that? Academic writing, you see, is always situated within an ongoing scholarly discourse, an ongoing scholarly conversation. We cannot read a particular research article or an academic answer in isolation. We have to read it in conjunction with other scholarly conversations or other scholarly texts. So, in the conclusion, if we articulate the implications of the argument, or if we indicate the limitations or the directions for future possible research, then the conclusion positions the text in relation to existing literature. The conclusion serves that very critical function because in the conclusion, the writer talks about the implications of the argument. He talks about the future scope for research. He can also talk about the limitations of the argument. So thereby, you see, there is a relationality. A relation is established with existing literature. And therefore, this positioning reinforces the writer's scholarly authority. It reinforces the writer's scholarly identity. Now let us pause here for a quiz. And let us ask ourselves the question. It is a very simple question, that which one of the following is not a rhetorical function of the conclusion? We have been discussing the rhetorical functions so far, but which one of these options is not a rhetorical function of the conclusion? And there are 4 options. Option A, closure. Option B, positioning. Option C, emphasis. And option D, knowledge production. If you recall the discussion that we have had, there are 3 rhetorical functions of the conclusion: closure, emphasis, and positioning. So therefore, if we deduce, the correct answer to this question is option D, that is knowledge production. Now, we have been talking about the conclusion, and I mentioned that the conclusion must synthesize the existing ideas that have been foregrounded in the earlier discussion. So, synthesis of ideas is crucial. But when I use the term synthesis, I do not imply summary. One of the most persistent misconceptions about the conclusion, the academic conclusion, is that it is a summary of ideas. It is almost synonymous with summaries. But what is the function of a summary? A summary merely recounts what has already been said. But synthesis involves integrating ideas. It integrates ideas to produce new meaning or new understanding. So this distinction is fundamental to writing effective academic conclusions, that a conclusion is not a summary of ideas. It seeks to synthesize the arguments and to produce new meaning. That is something that must be kept in mind while writing an academic conclusion. Also, in the conclusion of an answer or a research article, it is very important to tie up loose ends. In the body of an academic paper, if we were to examine the structure or the format of the academic paper, the body of the academic paper presents us with arguments. Now, these arguments, you will see, are often developed sequentially. They are developed in a sequence, one after the other. Each section of the paper or the answer addresses a specific aspect of the research question. And then, of course, it is supported by evidence and analysis. But you see, the conclusion need not revisit these points individually. There is no need for the conclusion to revisit each point individually. But what the conclusion should do is demonstrate how these points work together and how they support the overall argument. That is very important. All loose ends must be tied up in the conclusion of an academic answer or a research article. So you see, the conclusion has an integrative function. This synthesis that we have been talking about allows the writer to identify certain patterns. Certain patterns or relationships emerge. Certain thematic, overarching thematic relationships or patterns may emerge through the writing, and that has to be clearly and explicitly articulated in the conclusion of the academic answer or the research article. Let me give you an example. For example, a paper could be discussing or examining multiple case studies. Suppose a paper is being written and the writer has referred to various case studies. But you see, the conclusion need not refer to the individual case studies. What it could do is that it could move beyond the discussion of individual cases and it could provide a comparative insight. This comparative insight could enrich the conclusion of this particular research article. This is to give you an example. So the conclusion, remember, performs an integrative function. Now, how do we structure a conclusion? This is where we come to some practical tips about how to write the conclusion, how to structure a good conclusion. Now, there are three structural elements that must be remembered while writing an effective academic conclusion. The first is restatement of thesis or research focus. So how do we structure a conclusion? The first step is to restate the thesis or the research focus. Every academic answer or research article has a thesis statement, a primary thesis statement. The conclusion must begin typically by revisiting, restating the central thesis or the central research question or the objective of the paper. As arguments have developed and evidence has been evaluated, there is an analysis that is presented in the body of the answer or the paper. You see, through this process of analysis, the thesis often acquires greater nuance. So you understand that the concluding version of the thesis is probably more refined than the introductory counterpart. In the introduction, we present the ideas. In the body, we develop the ideas. So the conclusion is more nuanced in terms of the understanding that it conveys. So therefore, it is important that the central thesis, the primary argument, is restated. Now, this is a useful tip that you must remember, that when I talk about restatement, restatement does not mean repetition. Effective writing, academic writing, rephrases the thesis statement in a different language and in a more authoritative tone. It does not repeat simply the ideas that have been presented before. The second important structural element that must be remembered is integration, the integration of key arguments or research findings. Now, after you have restated the thesis in the conclusion of your answer, the conclusion must synthesize the main arguments or the findings. Now, this integration will demonstrate that individual sections have contributed to the overall claim. In this section, once again, a useful tip. In this section, it is better to use thematic organization rather than chronological repetition. There is no need to chronologically repeat the arguments that have occurred before, but an overall thematic organization of ideas can be stated in the conclusion. So the grouping of ideas conceptually must be emphasized in the conclusion. How the writer has grouped these ideas conceptually or thematically, this is what must be expressed through the conclusion. And it adds to the coherence and the validity of the research argument. This is very important that, one must not think that it is redundant. This exercise is very useful because it establishes the validity of the claim that has been made. Finally, the third structural element that we must remember is discussion of significance and implication. Now, this is particularly important while writing a term paper or a dissertation or a thesis. One of the most intellectually demanding aspects of the conclusion is articulating significance. What is the significance of the academic writing or the research that has been conducted? Now, you must answer implicitly the question, so what? And why does the argument matter? How do we establish significance? This is a tricky question. Many students falter in trying to answer this. How do I emphasize the significance of my arguments in the conclusion of an answer? Firstly, I can demonstrate or I can express the theoretical significance. I can address how the contribution of my argument or my research has added to existing scholarship. So that would be establishing the theoretical significance. I can state the theoretical significance. Second, I can also state the practical significance. That is, what are the applications of this particular kind of research in the professional or the real world context. This is also very important for any kind of empirical research. And thirdly, we can also establish the social and the cultural significance. Now, by talking about the social and the cultural significance, we highlight broader implications beyond the present or the limited academic context of the answer or the research paper. So while writing a conclusion, be mindful of these three things. How do you establish significance? You can either establish the theoretical significance of your work or the practical significance, if there is any, or also you can talk about the social and the cultural significance. Now let us have a quiz question here. That is, the question is, what is an integrative function of the academic conclusion? We have been talking about the integrative function of the conclusion for so long. So what is an integrative function of the academic conclusion? There are four options. Option A, restating ideas and arguments or repeating ideas and arguments. B, expressing the writer's opinion. C, establishing thematic patterns. And D, proposing diverse viewpoints. Now remember the question, it is talking about the integrative function. So if we think about the four options, we will know that the correct option is C, establishing thematic patterns. The conclusion integrates all the diverse themes that have been addressed in the academic answer or the research article. So it establishes a thematic relationship or an overall thematic pattern. There are certain linguistic features of an academic conclusion that we must remember while writing. Firstly, while writing a conclusion, use an evaluative language. Do not use a narrative or a descriptive language while writing a conclusion. Why an evaluative language? Because it signals judgment. It helps to form judgment and to establish significance. Use certain keywords. What are the keywords? You can use words such as notable or crucial or critical or significant. These words will immediately draw the attention of the reader to the main argument. It will foreground the key insights once again. Please remember that please do not use hyperboles, avoid exaggeration in the conclusion. Restate as the argument has developed in the course of the discussion. Please do not provide an exaggerated view of the argument. The second thing is hedging. Now, this is a critical, it's a technical term. What do you mean by hedging? Hedging is another important feature, particularly while discussing the implications of the research work or generalizations. Now, phrases such as findings, very often in the conclusion you will find that the research finding has been mentioned. This analysis indicates the inference. It allows the writers and the readers to infer certain claims without overstating certainty. So you can restate the primary thesis, or you can restate the claim of the paper or the academic article, but it does not overemphasize. So hedging is important. A middle ground has to be adopted. One must authoritatively enforce and establish the primary claim that is being made, but it must not be overstated. So therefore, hedging reflects the provisional nature of academic knowledge, that academic knowledge can always be built upon, it can always be expanded. So hedging, therefore, it tells us about the provisional nature of academic knowledge, and it is an important technique, linguistic technique to use while writing a conclusion. Now, after having understood what an academic conclusion is, how to write and structure an academic conclusion, what kind of language to use, let us also try to address some problems in writing an academic conclusion. One frequent error that students make in writing the conclusion is that they try to introduce new arguments or evidence. Now, that is incorrect. Since the conclusion is meant to synthesize rather than develop ideas, introducing a new idea or introducing a new argument or new material in the conclusion can confuse the readers. So avoid doing that. That is a problem. A last-minute thought is often hastily written in the conclusion. That is to be avoided. That creates problems. It disrupts the coherence of the writing. Another issue or a problem is overgeneralization. In an attempt to emphasize the significance, what the writer often does is that he makes certain claims which are not supported by evidence. These claims are weak because there is no supporting, no substantiating evidence to it, and it can invite criticism. It can challenge the credibility of the writing. So that is once again a problem of academic writing, overgeneralization. The third pitfall is abruptness. If you are reading an academic answer or a research article and suddenly you see that it ends abruptly, it ends without any caution, then that is also disruptive for the reader. The reading experience is disrupted. So if the conclusion is too brief or if it is underdeveloped, then it can leave the readers dissatisfied. So, given the complexity of the academic arguments, make sure that the conclusion has sufficient space in the academic answer, that it fulfills its function of giving closure. And finally, the last problem is that many students tend to adopt certain formulaic approaches. There are certain mechanical phrases that they introduce. There is no criticality. In other words, they don't engage critically with the material that has been analyzed or studied before. So, it's important that an effective conclusion, a good academic conclusion, should be thoughtful, it should be critical in its focus as well as in its writing. There is no rigid template that must be followed, but these points have to be remembered. Now, let us here once again briefly pause and ask ourselves a quiz question. That is, which one of these linguistic styles should be used while writing a conclusion? We have been talking about the linguistic style that has to be adopted while writing an academic conclusion. So which one of these linguistic styles should you use while writing a conclusion? And there are 4 options. Option A, expository. Option B, evaluative. Option C, descriptive. And option D, narrative. Now remember that the conclusion must have a certain degree of criticality. It cannot be expository in nature. It cannot use descriptive or narrative language. So what is the linguistic style that should be adopted while writing an academic conclusion? The correct option is B, evaluative. An evaluative style is necessary while writing an academic conclusion. We must therefore try to write strong conclusions, just as the introduction must be impactful. So the conclusion likewise must also bear an impact. A strong conclusion demonstrates that the writer has understood not only what they have argued, but why that argument matters. It shows awareness of the audience. I know the audience that I am reaching out to. There is an awareness of the audience, of the discipline, of the scholarly context within which my work is situated. So in academic writing, conclusion plays a strategic role in shaping the reception of the work. Let us not consider the conclusion lightly. It is not to be taken lightly because it is a clear exposition, a clear articulation of the contribution and the impact of the study, the research article, or the academic answer that has been written. Thank you.